Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We've got a great turnout. I'm really happy about that. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar, which I feel is very important because highly hazardous pesticides are such a mysterious issue. Most people don't realize that highly hazardous pesticides are actually affecting them almost every day through the food that they eat or the environment that they're in. And we can't be involved in our in active citizenry if we don't understand these issues and technical terms, etc. So there is a tremendous amount of advocacy going on in niche pockets of NGOs and affected groups who are severely affected. And the intention of this webinar is for a broader base of those that are stakeholders that have some kind of influence on highly hazardous pesticide policy and regulation and governance to be better equipped to use their influence to make better decisions, as well as those in research to demystify all of these very technical terms and this really, really challenging language, be able to advocate for their rights better. And we can only do that by understanding these issues. So I will get to my section last. We have a great lineup of speakers, some of the most internationally renowned experts in the field of highly hazardous pesticides. We have Susan Haffmans from PAN, who is a senior advisor to PAN Germany and on the board of PAN International. And PAN is probably one of the most foremost advocacy NPOs worldwide for highly hazardous pesticides and pesticides. And then we've got our homegrown heroes, Professor Rother of UCT Department of Environmental Health, Professor Leslie London from the Department of Public Health at UCT, and Debbie Muir, who's in the Department of Fisheries, Forestry and Environment, who's very active in highly hazardous pesticide policy, both within her department and at a SADC level. So, and then you'll have me. So without much further ado, let me make sure that our presenters can share their screens. And Susan, I would love to give the webinar over to you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for the invite, and yeah, thanks for looking into HHPs more closely. I'm trying to share my screen. Okay, so thanks so much. As introduced, my name is Susan Haffmans. I'm with PAN Germany, and I'm taking you with me on some background information on the PAN pesticide list, so which are really good tools to support a phase out of HHPs. Just some words. I'm with PAN International and with PAN Germany and PAN International. So we are working to replace hazardous pesticides with ecological sound and social just alternatives. PAN International is a global network which is coordinated by 5 regional centers. We are active for more than 40 years now, and they're engaged, more than 600 engaged organizations in over 90 countries. So highly hazardous pesticides, as defined by the FAO, WHO, highly hazardous pesticides are acknowledged to present particular high levels of acute or chronic hazards to health or the environment. And in addition, pesticides that appear to cause severe or irreversible harm to health and the environment under condition of use in a country may be considered to be and treated as highly hazardous. So that is the definition. Yeah. And so we see it is supposed to be a relative small share of all pesticides globally, but yet they cause the most harm. And that is why they are in international focus. It's a particular concern in low and middle income countries where they have the most impact and where we still have quite big shares of highly hazardous pesticides in use. and often they are old compounds and some of them relatively cheap. So according to FAO WHO, in the Detoxifying Agriculture report, highly hazardous pesticides cause adverse social, environmental, and economic effects that undermine the achievement of sustainable development. And exposure to HHP is regarded as a major public health concern. And so I would like to dive with you and look, so the term that was introduced nearly 20 years ago, so by the FAO Council, and already then they considered a progressive ban of HHPs because they knew about their harm, about their toxic profile and about the risk. So in 2008, FAO WHO joint meeting of pesticide management did set criteria that were defining HHPs, and it was also planned to come up with a list, but that never happened. There is no official list. So that is where PAN jumped in, because for Pesticide Action Network, it was clear that if you want to phase out HHPs, you first need to identify them. So that was in 2009, where the first PAN list was published, and it was reworked. It was discussed in expert rounds, and so we had our last update December last year. In 2015, the so-called SciChem, so the Strategic Approach to International Chemical Management, listed HHPs as a global issue of concern, and the corresponding international conference emphasized replacing HHPs with agroecological alternatives. But then in 2020, when the UNEP assessed progress, they were very clear, telling that there's little progress on HHPs. So then in 2 years ago, 2023, that we had two important meetings and decisions. That was the Global Framework on Chemical, which is the successor to SciChem, acknowledged the need to act globally by including the phase out of HHPs into one of their targets, and also by agreeing on the establishment of the Global Alliance on HHPs. And it was the same year where the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework set a target to cut by half biodiversity risk from pesticides. So, and then the global framework decision was also followed by UN Environmental Assembly. They called for action to eliminate the use of the world's most toxic pesticides. So it seems that everything is clear. We have to act, and this is not only something that is clear since yesterday, but for quite a while. So we will look into the criteria defined by FAO WHO, and then I will walk you through the PAN list and what you can do with it. So the criteria, as laid down in the guidelines, you have 8 criteria. The first one is on acute toxicity, and that is if a pesticide is extremely hazardous, class 1A, or highly hazardous class 1B, according to WHO. And then you have the chronic or long-term health effects, carcinogenicity, mutagenicity, and reproductive toxicity, according to GHS, so the Global Harmonized System. And then you have if a pesticide is listed under one of those binding conventions, the Stockholm, Rotterdam Convention, or the Montreal Protocol. And then there's criterion 8, which is a bit different because it's less clear how to translate this into a substance or pesticide list, is the pesticide active ingredients and formulation that have shown a high incidence or severe or irreversible adverse effects on human health and the environment. So that was the criteria set, and PAN looked into it, and we discussed, or experts from PAN discussed those criteria, and they also identified gaps because the for our understanding, the criteria is a bit weak on environmental criteria. And for example, and I will share this with the next slide, we also thought that there needs some added criteria. But the PAN list is substantially founded in the WHO FAO criteria, and that you can see here. So we go a bit beyond. For example, for the acute toxicity, as WHO doesn't take into account inhalative toxicity, we added this because we think if a pesticide is fatal if inhaled, according to GHS, this should also be regarded as a higher acute toxicity. Because if people open their container with pesticide, that's maybe the first contact they have. So, and there were others like, so we, in addition to GHS for identifying carcinogenicity, mutagenicity, and so on, we also added, for example, US EPA decision. So this is all based on decision by respected agencies. And okay, so, and for the criterion 8, it's a bit more difficult, but we thought that also environment must be looked into a lot more. So we took on pesticides that fulfill 2 out of the criteria for PBT criterion. This is persistent, bioaccumulative, or toxic. So if 2 of those criteria are fulfilled, that is following a system that the EU is using. So we put this on the list. But you can see that it is very transparent. So you can always see, for example, for the acute toxicity, that is the yellow first columns, you see that you have WHO 1A, 1B, and then you have the fatal if inhaled toxicity according to GHS H330. So you can see why a pesticide was taken on this list. So it's full transparency here. And the types you see here for monocrotophos, you see that it got 3 hits because it's highly hazardous, acute, and it is also, has a high B toxicity, and it is listed under PIC. So it hits in 3 different categories. So if there's 2 hits in one category, that is not counted. So that is the possibility to read those lists. We have another list that is the Pan-International Consolidated List of Banned Pesticides, which consists of 2 documents, while the HHP list is 1 document. So here you have a separate explanatory note, and then you have the spreadsheet. And we are now with the 7th edition, which includes information of for 168 countries, and you can see that 1 or more of these countries have banned a total of 568 pesticides, active ingredients, and this list only looks into those that are supposed to be currently in use. Obsolete pesticides are not covered. So you see, and you find there also, okay, other countries maybe have already phased out and banned pesticides, and they are still growing and doing agriculture and so on. That could also help a country who is aiming at phasing out a specific pesticide to maybe get in contact, get some information. Well, how is it done there? So those lists can really be used. It enables stakeholders to identify HHPs and encourage them to take action to phase out their use in agriculture. It provides also basis for priority setting that can look very differently. You could, of course, start with those that have the most hits, or you can start with those where a phase out is the most easily done in your country or less difficult, or you start with those that because you say, well, we have so many poisonings from these or that pesticide, we start with them. So it is really useful, and it's open, and it's quite flexible for countries how to use those lists. It provides also a basis for civil society to monitor what's going on and how many HHPs they have in their countries, and to support phasing out. It is also can be used to identify double standards, so that maybe you in your country you still use and get imports from of pesticide that are prohibited at the country that is exporting. So that is an example we did 2 years ago. Export if EU banned pesticides from EU countries to South Africa. So that's on our website if you are interested. Okay, and phasing out HHPs, that means, of course, you need to phase in alternatives. And you really have to start often keeping to old compounds and sticking with them prevents also investment in alternatives. So that is a publication done a while ago. So you can look at more structural and approach. There is also the International People's Agroecology Movement platform. That is how in different regions farmers are growing with agroecological methods. We also provide, and there's a lot more, there's also the possibility to look into specific compounds like chlorpyrifos that was just discussed at Stockholm Convention last week. There's a lot of alternatives to chlorpyrifos available, and same with paraquat, for example. So with this, I thank you, and I close my presentation. There are contact details if you are interested. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan, for that great presentation and for all of your incredible work. PAN's list has been an incredible tool for UnPoison to develop our list of highly hazardous pesticides. So thank you so, so much. As the audience can see, it's a highly technical topic, and the value of this webinar is going to come specifically from asking questions, so that we can actually achieve the intention of this webinar, which is to demystify highly hazardous pesticides. I think, Susan, I would love that the paper on export to South Africa. I will share that with our network. And also a note on chlorpyrifos. Chlorpyrifos has just been banned. I think they and the other experts in our webinar can confirm this. I think it's meant to have, it got banned last year, and I think there's a year for it to be phased out, if somebody can just confirm that I'm correct. And there has been tremendous outcry and fear, I think, from the agricultural sector about not having alternatives. So thank you. That's tremendously useful, your list of alternatives there. Right. I can't see that there are any questions. Andrea, are you available to start your presentation?
I am.
Great. Would you like an introduction, or would you like to introduce yourself?
I can introduce myself if you like.
That would be great. Thanks, Andrea.
Okay. I also have multiple screens, so now I don't know where my video, there we are, my video camera is. So hello, good afternoon to everyone. I am Andrea Rother. I'm head of the Environmental Health Division at the University of Cape Town in the School of Public Health. And I have been working on pesticide issues for nearly 30 years. So thank you very much for the invitation. And it's nice to follow Susan. I will be repeating some things that she actually mentioned, and I always think repetition is very good. So I'm going to look a bit more into what's been happening in the international arena on HHPs. And firstly, there we go. Firstly, I just want to contextualize, and Susan has done this somewhat already. you know, often there's a tendency to think about, when we think about highly hazardous pesticides or pesticides in general, we tend to think about agriculture and we think about the use in agriculture. However, we extensively use pesticides in South Africa in many different sectors. And you can see on the screen that we use it in the domestic sector, in our homes, for forestry, leisure, if you go to a hotel, or even in many of our offices and buildings are sprayed. We use it for public health control, we use it in schools, and we spray at the bottom of the boats, for example, for cargo ships, and the list goes on. And I think the reason why it's important to understand that and contextualize that is that HHPs will occur in many of these sectors, not just in agriculture, and that we may think we're not being exposed to HHPs because either we think we're eating organically or we're not working in agriculture. However, we are all exposed. I think it's also important to make clear that all pesticides are poisonous. There's no such thing as a safe pesticide. They're meant to kill, they're meant to destroy, whether it's the pest or some sort of disease. They have varying degrees of toxicity. And as Susan already said, what we're talking about today is a small portion of pesticides that are extremely highly hazardous. And a survey that was done by the FAO in 2021 actually identified that in several low and middle income countries, that it was between 6 to 10% of the pesticides that were registered and being used that were actually classified as HHPs. So one of the things that I want to shed light on is that there's actually quite a lot of work that's being done on HHPs, and you've already seen that, some of it. And then I want to really dive into why is the small number of pesticides causing so much harm and so many efforts to try and control, and yet we're not really managing to control them. Susan already highlighted the FAO-WHO joint meeting on pesticide management, 8 criteria. And it's important to remember these criteria because there is a tendency to define HHPs in different ways. And I think it's important to stick to this criteria. With adding additional I think is fine. But if you start taking some of the criteria away, it can be a bit problematic. In South Africa, we don't actually produce any of the active ingredients. We import all our active ingredients and then formulate the products in country. And Susan already alluded to the issue of the double standards. So many of these highly hazardous pesticides are old molecules, are no longer registered for use in many high-income countries because of their toxicity. However, they still can legally be produced in those countries to export to, for example, to South Africa. So looking at some of the initiatives, or if we look at more sort of the legally and non-legally binding mechanisms that are available, there are quite a few that highly hazardous pesticides fall under. And you've already heard reference to the Rotterdam, Stockholm, Basel Conventions, the Montreal Protocol, for example, which are all making up part of the HHP criteria. And that these are legally binding if a country is a signatory to them. We then have non-legally binding agreements, such as the International Code of Conduct on Pesticide Management, which I will come back to, that refers to HHPs. Also, the globally harmonized system of classification and labeling of chemicals that Susan referred to as well, which is also part of the HHP criteria. And then there's some more indirect ones, which Susan also had referred to on her timeline, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity. So there are quite a lot of agreements that in effect play a role with looking at HHPs. However, may not necessarily completely be instrumental in removing them. So we already saw a timeline, and this is a bit more of a detailed timeline. And what I find important is this starting point that in 1975, the WHO actually had their first booklet that they produced, which is the WHO recommended classification of pesticides by hazard. And the two classes that they had, so they have four, but the two that are important for HHPs is the extremely and highly hazardous pesticides, which is referred to in the HHP criteria. So the 1A and the 1B. So a recognition in 1975 already of this need to classify pesticides differently, even though they all have a toxicity, that there needs to be this classification that some have to be dealt with differently, and particularly the extremely and highly hazardous ones. Then the Rotterdam Convention, which is also listed as an HHP criteria, came into force in 2004. Then you heard mention of the joint meeting, so in 2007, where they started debating about highly hazardous pesticides, and then coming up with a criteria, which was then put forward and recommended in 2008. And then where the International Code of Conduct hadn't been referring to highly hazardous pesticides specifically, nor had a definition, was then introduced to the International Code of Conduct in 2013. So you can see that there is, from a long period of time, this effort to start to pull together the need to identify and address highly hazardous pesticides, so that it's not a new issue. And I think what one needs to keep in mind is the fact is that we're still dealing with it, even though there's this long history of trying to address highly hazardous pesticides. And then it carries on with a guideline that was released by FAO and WHO in 2016. The World Health Assembly also in 2017 recognizing HHPs. Then an action plan that was developed in 2020 and 21. I mentioned the Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which then adopted a target that was looking at the risk of highly hazardous pesticides and addressing it by 2030. And as Susan mentioned, the Global Framework on Chemicals, which had a resolution for a global alliance. And now this is important because if you look at all the initiatives that have been happening, and yet we still globally, particularly in low and middle income countries, having problems with HHPs. So there's this need to have a collective that is supporting a much faster pace at addressing and phasing out HHPs. Importantly, in 2023, it came the guideline on alternatives, and also Susan very importantly raised the issue of alternatives. The argument for not being able to address HHPs is often that there's no alternatives available, whereas there are many alternatives and many alternative processes. It's just the willingness or the access to that information that needs to be there. In 2023, a task force was put together by FAO, the International Labour Organization, the UN Development Programme, UNEP, and WHO, where they've started to work on a modality of a global alliance. We don't have a global alliance yet, but they've been working on it. There also was a resolution. You have these different UN bodies, so you have health, agriculture, environment, and many of them are now having their different resolutions in supporting the elimination of HHPs and harmful pesticides. And in 2024, the World Health Organization came out with a policy brief highlighting how much HHPs are actually linked to suicide and self-harm cases. And they had this policy brief on preventing suicide through the phase out of HHPs. So it's not only HHPs exposures by workers in agriculture or the public, but also that people are using and have access to these extremely harmful pesticides for self-harm. I just briefly want to touch on the Global Alliance, which we hope will be launched in 2026. The intention had been that it would be a bit earlier. Unfortunately, there have been various reasons for why not. But they have 4 kind of focus areas, and I mentioned this need to have a global group that is actually working collectively together. So looking at governance and policy, monitoring, surveillance, promoting transition to sustainable crop production and alternatives, and knowledge dissemination. And what's important is that if members of the group have to adhere to and comply with the resolution, which is that they would agree then to a phasing out of HHPs. This is not exhaustive. It only went up to 2020 and is something that I think is worth looking at, perhaps trying to get a more exhaustive list, but just to show you, what countries have been doing individually and how important it is for identifying HHPs, and not only identifying and the complexity of, needing to have a list. So having a South African list, having a Southern African development community list, having an international list like the PAN one are so important to help support countries who have a lack of capacity to perhaps identify. So you can see, from Mozambique, eliminating and identifying 61 products, to Turkey in 2020, withdrawing from the market 16 products. There is this document, a 4-page document, I think, case studies on action taken on highly hazardous pesticides that came out by UNEP in 2023 that you can have a look at. Again, it gives examples from different countries. Then there's this recent paper on paraquat and illustrating the countries that have been banning paraquat. And having that, again, that collective understanding of the action that's being taken. I also wanted to kind of shout out to the fact that there are so many players in the arena of HHPs, and this is not exhaustive. You have the Center for Pesticide Suicide Prevention at the University of Edinburgh, who are working on projects in Asian and African countries. You have the different regional PAN action networks, creating their lists, but also working in countries on alternatives. You have the Jeff-funded Farm Project that is doing HHP identification, elimination, and looking for alternatives. You have the International Pesticide Standard Alliance that is looking at banning of HHPs. Then you have us at UCT, who've had communities of practice and supporting academic learning for students on HHPs. You have the Southern African Pesticide Regulators Forum, who have a strategy and have had developed an HHP list, and also a biopesticide strategy, which Debbie will talk about. You have the East African Community, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, for example, who are all working collectively together to harmonize pesticide regulations and phase out procedures for HHPs. But we need this collective where we know what each other is doing and to support each other, particularly, as I said, in resource poor countries. And of course, there's UnPoison, which is doing great work on HHP work in South Africa. I want to flag that we're talking about identifying highly hazardous pesticides. We talked about internationally the efforts that are happening to identify them. And then there's this desire to phase them out, eliminate them, and replace with alternatives. But it's important to understand the language of phase out. in many countries, there's a phase out, and Anna referred to chlorpyrifos having a year phase out period. So you've identified a pesticide that is causing extreme health effects and environmental effects to the point of where you want to remove it so that exposure doesn't continue. However, the government gives a year to 2 years for it to be phased out, so there's no stockpiles. And, this is an ethical and human rights violation. That why should exposure continue? And it's important that we really push not only for a phase out, but that there's no phase out period, or that there's an immediate withdrawal, and that the industry be accountable for then taking any stockpiles back. I think that's important to understand. Also, all these good intentions and actions that are taking place, but it's slow, and exposures are continuing, and people are continuing to be poisoned. And really, one has to ask why. Why is this continuing? And to look at what data is available to see the amount of money that is being made on the sales of HHPs. In 2018, 23 billion, accounting for 40% of the global pesticide market, and where HHPs are making up a significant percentage of that. And so it's really this aspect of, is it wealth over health, or is it health over wealth? And what can we do? What is needed to change that narrative, both in terms of having alternatives, but also political will? And here, just showing again that more than a third of the income came from the sale of chemicals listed as highly hazardous pesticides in crop life companies. And if you look at the different colors, so red is the acutely toxic and blue is the chronic hazards to humans. Again, it's really to understand how much money is being made from a small amount of pesticides that are causing a high amount of harm. So just to conclude, there are a lot of efforts that have been going on for a long time, starting in 1975 with WHO identifying that there are very highly hazardous pesticides and the need for action with those. But the action is too slow to really protect the health of millions of people within our country, but in other countries as well. And in many cases, industry has played a big role in delaying this by putting wealth over health, and that we need to continue changing that narrative. And to change that narrative, how much national action is needed, and the need for players like UnPoison and others to support national action on identifying and phasing out HHPs, and to stop the importation of highly hazardous pesticides. So thank you, and I'm open to any questions.
Thank you so much, Andrea. While I wait to see if there are any hands up or questions in the chat, I have a question about SAPREF. If you wouldn't mind explaining a little bit more about what SAPREF is, who engages in SAPREF, is it all of our government departments that are responsible for governing pesticides and HHPs, and how is Department of Agriculture engaging in that forum?
So the Southern African Pesticide Regulators Forum was set up in 2011 with the support of FAO, UCT, the Swedish Chemical Agency. Am I missing someone? I think that was it. And the idea was to, previous to that, any regional body was actually organized by the industry. So the idea was to give governments an opportunity in the Southern African development community, of which there are 16 at the moment, to work together without the guidance of the industry. And the idea was to have representation from the three main government departments that regulate pesticides within the countries, and they vary. It's not always the same, but it's health, agriculture, and environment. And the idea is to always have 2 or 3 representatives who participate in both online and physical meetings. And SAPREF does things like, so it has developed a strategy on pesticide management for the region, and the ministers have signed it. And the idea is to use it for guiding on developing legislation within the different countries. And then they've also developed a strategy on highly hazardous pesticides, which is in the process of being signed by all the ministers, for then as a regional grouping for the countries nationally to implement the strategy. Did I address all your questions?
Which of our departments are part of SAPREF, and do they engage?
So we have environment, health, and agriculture that attend, and it waxes and wanes, the levels of engagement, depending. Sometimes environment have been very active, sometimes health, and sometimes agriculture. At the moment, we do have support from agriculture. I see there's some discussion going on about disposal, and I think, you know, that whole point that I raised about the phase out period. I mean, I think it's important to understand that it's not just taking back the containers, but it's also taking back any of the unused chemicals as well. So basically what is happening with the phase out period is that there will be a limit on not being able to formulate any new products. However, you can continue to use. It's complicated. You know, how do you control that when you've got products on the farm? But when you have extremely highly hazardous pesticides, is it justified that, you know, just to get rid of the stock, that farmers can continue to put it on the food that we eat and expose the workers, contaminate the soil? So those are the kind of questions one needs to engage with at when a pesticide is labeled as a, for example, a WHO 1A, or whether it's carcinogenic, mutagenic, or has reproductive toxicity. It should be taken back by the industry for the industry then to dispose of in a proper manner as legislated.
Thanks, Andrea. There is so much terminology, and even the words like carcinogenic and mutagenic and reproductive tox, these words almost desensitize you to exactly the health impacts and the very real consequences of exposure that we get every day. And like you brought up, Andrea, pesticides are not just something that is happening out in the farmlands, and for farmers and farm workers. There's a very high usage of pesticides in our urban and residential environment, with rat poisons, with the weed killers that get sprayed. I know that there are a lot of people from Poison Free Peninsula, thank you, Nanette, on this webinar. And I saw recently, I don't have the stats at my fingertips, but Professor Raymond Chow and Leslie Petrick, I believe, were involved in a study that I will share as a resource after the webinar, which I think showed a massive spike in highly hazardous pesticides going into rivers passing through cities because of all the very highly hazardous pesticides that we are using and that we don't know about. So yeah, just again, the invitation is to please use this webinar as ordinary people, no matter what your position is, even if you're a researcher or a scientist, and very much so civil society. Please make sure you ask as many questions as you can so that you are really empowered to exercise your influence around about what happens for you in your living space and in your workspace, and the food system. Are there any other questions for, right, there's one here from Kathy Bull, who's from provincial government, and It says, Andrea, you mentioned a great need for broader understanding of alternatives and alternative approaches. We are keen to gather this info and assist to disseminate such info. Great. I think there's a lot of work to do, Kathy, and especially with regards to what I just brought up about the urban use of pesticides and highly hazardous pesticides. But I'll let Andrea talk to this as well.
Yeah, thanks for that. One of the things that was on my timeline, which I forgot to mention, was that the FAO has a registration toolkit. And one of the things that they've done is this recognition of the need for alternatives with highly hazardous pesticides. So they actually have a module that you can take online, a training module on alternatives. It's complicated in the sense that, alternatives, firstly, we shouldn't be replacing one chemical with another chemical where we then have what's called a regrettable substitution. So that is, we've replaced it with something that in a year later becomes an HHP itself, or in a few years' time. So it's a careful process of looking at, well, what is it that we're actually using the chemical for? So for example, you're using extremely highly hazardous pesticides. Some of the pellets that we use are banned in other countries, and we're using it for rat control. Well, what are the alternatives? Well, there are many alternatives that are non-chemical, for example, rat traps, but it's also looking in the townships at the conditions that people are living in and having to have better refuse collection. So it's really important that we don't have that thinking of replacing a highly hazardous pesticide with another chemical per se. That we look at all the possibilities, and that we move away from a monoculture farming system which relies on this heavy use of chemicals to more of a, whether it's an agroecology approach, a permaculture approach, or organic, looking at where we're actually protecting the health of the soil, for example. However, the one question we always get, and particularly from politicians, is, well, what are the alternatives and where are the lists? And there are efforts being made. And you saw all the documents that Susan shared on the alternatives to chlorpyrifos, and some of them are very crop specific. So I do encourage you to have a look at those. I see Sizwe has his hand up.
He does, and there's also a question from Sharon Pollard about highly hazardous compounds used in the mining sector that sit as legacy chemicals. Are these non-pesticides being considered as well?
So those wouldn't be legislated as a pesticide. So that would be a different category of dealing with those and under different legislation.
Sizwe, are you able to find your mic? I see your hand up. If you can, great.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Good everyone. I just want to ask, considering, for example, our socioeconomic challenges in the country, almost 40% unemployment, people just want to eat. People just want to eat, and where that food comes from, or how it's grown, is normally not even stated in the packaging. People just want to eat. And how do we conscientize people about eating having organically grown foods? Because it's often deemed as being expensive, Woolworths type of food. And we know the majority of our people can't afford to go to and buy food at Woolworths. So how do we raise an awareness campaign that caters for the unemployed, for the poorly paid, considering that they also right now the cost of living is one of the biggest problems. I mean, just transport is apparently 40% of people's earnings. So how do we get this to be a common issue and not a elitist issue, which is what a lot of people try and, yeah, often say. Thank you.
Thanks, Sizwe, for that. You know, you raise the way that you've expressed it is very, very illustrative of the complexity of the situation and of the context, um, and that there's so many issues involved that it's not just, you know, let's get rid of HHPs and everything will be okay. So I think what I have found in the past, so for example, there was recently a pesticide tribunal where a lot of workers were attending and people who struggle to make ends meet. And we imparted with a lot of information, and it again became clear that people don't have access to information where there's this assumption that the government is regulating things and looking after people's health in terms of the way they're regulating the food, and also then making alternatives viable. So for example, if people are aware that they're spending a lot of the time going to the doctor having allergies or asthma or other issues that are actually related to the fact that the food they've eaten or the pesticides they've been exposed to in that food, that by looking for alternatives in the sense of having, you know, market gardens, growing food yourself, or even having the informal vendors or people who are unemployed involved in the food production aspect and system without using chemicals. So where do you begin? You know, again, you have to have drivers. You need community initiatives. You need champions who take this on. Then you always have to have a few people in the community who are willing to experiment. People are often, you know, not necessarily convinced until people with who are respected in a community, who then maybe are a trailblazer and maybe do the market gardens or tell people about the hazards in pesticides. So it needs a collective group of champions, and it's not a quick response, but it is possible.
Thanks, Andrea. I'd love to jump in there as well and give a shout out to the People's Tribunal for Agrotoxins. I think there are some of the drivers on the call and also yourself and Professor London that were experts. The People's Tribunal for Agrotoxins was a ground-up grassroots and is a ground-up grassroots movement, and I'll add the website, specifically to give voices to the voiceless and to all of the people that seem to be forgotten when we talking about organic food or the Woolies aisle, etc. And from UnPoison's perspective, the reason that we target regulation and legislation is because it's the greatest possible impact. So we're largely unresourced. It's a volunteer network, and I'll explain our campaign when it's my turn at the end. But the way that we're getting involved and not forgetting about the other 66 million South Africans who might not have the exposure or the privilege of information and using knowledge for power, you know, to choose health over hunger. we're trying to use all of our resources and available energy to change the regulations so that at the most strategic point of influence that can ripple down across the whole country and all of the affected stakeholder groups. And then it's also about perception of pesticides, again, as Andrea mentioned. Thank you so much, Andrea. Thank you for being available. Andrea's got a slot now between 3 and 4. Andrea, maybe jump on again at 4. Sorry, again, as Andrea mentioned, and sorry to take up time from you, Prof. London, is we have to change the perception that pesticides are only out in agriculture. So as you're from Naledi, and there was the very traumatic incident of the kids that ingested turbofos and died, and that was being sold as rat poison in the urban or township context. And so, yeah, we need people like you, Sizwe, to help change the narrative and to ask more questions. And all of the people that are on this call that have resources, I will ask them to share and help to share those after the webinar as well. One of the major challenges, again, that we have is technical language in English. And we rely on other activists and those interested to help be the bridge and the gap until we have knowledge and information and the ability to really, really help everybody in South Africa have the same level of awareness about their environments and their food, and empower people with the ability to exercise their human rights to demand that. So without further ado, Prof. London, I will hand over to you. If you are ready.
Yes, hello everybody, and I shall find me to talk, and like the others, I will repeat this, but if you not, let me just make this full screen. Okay, I'm talking about health issues and exposure pathways. I hope my network stays stable. As have been said, we know what pesticides are, but just remember we apply them in the environment. It's not like a medicine or a vaccine where you give it to an individual. We apply them in an open environment, whether it's a workplace or a school. So by definition, it will have impact on a wider environment. Classically, toxic effects on bees, but back in the days in the US, when it was trying to control vector-borne disease, it would spray a beach with DDT, and it's targeting the vector, but of course it impacted on the kids playing on the beach. Okay, so we've had this, what are highly hazardous pesticides. Let's just repeat that. I'm going to talk about what are acute hazards, what are chronic hazards. They can be hazards both for humans and the environment. The reference refers to international classification systems, and importantly, it also talks about use conditions in a country, which I'll speak about a little. And as has been said, it's based on a recognition that a limited number of pesticides, even if they are sold in huge quantities, appear to be responsible for a disproportionate share of impacts. So what do we mean by acute exposure? Acute hazard. What it means is that the effects typically arise quickly. We're talking about hours, sometimes days. It's typically a single exposure, but sometimes repeated exposures can result in acute health outcome. And we measure it by measuring what's called the lethal dose 50, which is how much of a pesticide is required to kill 50% of laboratory animals, gruesome as it may sound. Those animals are usually rats, laboratory rats, but sometimes different models are used. And we express that as the gram of pesticide per gram of body weight of the animal. And so what it means is the less pesticide you need to kill the animal on average, the more toxic it is. In other words, the lower the LD50, the more toxic the chemical is. So the WHO has a classification for acute toxicity based largely on LD50s, ingestion, and some dermal. It's a slightly complicated system, but they come up with these categories 1A and 1B of hazardous pesticides. 1A are extremely hazardous, and 1B are hazardous, highly hazardous. The difference is really a set of classifications of dermal and ingested toxicities. Most of the hazardous pesticides in the WHO classification are organophosphates or carbamates. You can see of the 29 category 1A pesticides, about half organophosphates and carbamates, and the same proportion, about half, are 1B pesticides. Some of the other agents are coumarins, so those are the rat poisons, the anticoagulants. There's only one organochlorine, interestingly listed, that's hexachlorobenzene. There are a group of other different chemicals, such as heavy metals, etc. But that's a group of class 1A and 1B pesticides classified as acutely toxic, highly acutely toxic, 91 in total. Most of the group are organophosphates and carbamates. And just to explain how it works, when they're absorbed, what happens is the organophosphates and carbamates block an enzyme which is responsible for breaking down a chemical in our nervous system. That chemical operates at the junction of the nerve head, and the next transmission, which is usually a muscle or perhaps another nerve. And what normally happens is that an enzyme breaks down these neurotransmitters called acetylcholine in a steady state. So our bodies are able to function because you have a balance between the neurotransmitter and the transmission, because the chemical is broken down over time. If the pesticide blocks the enzyme, that neurotransmitter doesn't get broken down. So you get overactivity of the nervous system, overstimulation, depending on what the nerve is innervating, whether it's a muscle or a gland or another organ, you will have an overactivity. So that's why you get tremor, you get eye disturbance, you get salivation, all those symptoms from organophosphate poisoning. If it's severe, it will affect your ability to breathe, your heart rhythm, and can be fatal. So the organophosphates generally have a suffix, either PHOS or FOS or thion, but not all of them are easily recognizable that way. Demeton, for example. Carbamates, they might have carb in the title, aldicarb, carbaryl, but some of them don't obviously look like carbamates. But these are the highly hazardous organophosphates and carbamates. The others, as I said, include arsenates, fluorosilicates, organic fluoride compounds, which are also rat poisons. So that's the spectrum of chemicals that we see are WHO 1A and 1B acute toxins. The action can be very rapid. So this is a picture from a publication by Chinese researchers. They gave a case report of a 43-year-old female farmer who died within 3 hours of starting to apply turbofos. You can see it's a powder on the nails, and it illustrates how dermal routes of exposure are really important for most pesticides. How do people get exposed to pesticides? Well, 4 routes, basically: through the mouth. You can swallow it in food or water. You can breathe it in your lungs, or it can get into your eyes, which is a form of skin exposure, but particular for the eyes. In general, the inhalation is a route of exposure that's particularly important for people who work in closed environments. So here you have a picture of a farm worker who's mixing pesticides in a storeroom. He's got a full-on respirator to protect him, as well as other protective clothing. But someone in a closed environment working with pesticides will have an inhalation risk far more than a worker outdoors in a field. That's not to say that it doesn't cause problems, but the systemic poisoning that occurs with pesticides through inhalation is usually in somebody who's worked in a closed environment. Similarly, splashing in the eyes is typically an occupational risk. And you can see from this picture that if that worker had bent forward just as he poured the water in, who knows, maybe the splash from the water going into the backpack tank. The concentrate might have got in his eyes. He doesn't have goggles, but that's really an occupational exposure. The most common route of exposure for pesticides is dermal, and most of that is because pesticides are delivered through the skin. This is a picture of a farm worker who was a spray operator. Started the day with a hat and a white armband around his arm. You can see, if you look closely, he's topped up with a little respirator device to measure his breathing zone, little portable pump. But by the end of the day, he'd been spraying with something called DNOC. By the end of the day, that white armband, or the end of the shift, was completely yellow, and the pesticide is yellow. So it just goes to show the extent to which pesticides can be deposited on the surface of the body as opposed to breathing it in. And this is one of the consequences. This man is a spray operator on a cotton farm. He's using a backpack and he's walking through the cotton that he sprays the whole day. And he absorbs that pesticide through his skin as an occupational hazard. Of course, is another major route, whether it comes through diet, whether it comes as an accident, and sometimes whether it comes as intentional self-harm. A big problem in many parts of the world, also a problem in South Africa, but one which we don't really have a good handle on. And then, of course, there are the cumulative environmental exposures. The picture on the top left, you'll see a rural town in the Western Cape. On the edge of the town is a vineyard, and there's the tractor, if you can see it, sort of going down the road, up the road actually, and you can see the drift easily wafting across the road onto the houses, and you can see running up the road is a pedestrian running away from the tractor to avoid being covered by this drift. In rural areas, this is quite standard, that the agricultural production really abuts the town. The slide below shows a mixing point on a farm area where a tractor has pulled up, the tank has been filled with water to mix with the pesticide, and you can see the runoff into the donga. And if it gets into a water system that children play in or swim or people drink, there's a cumulative exposure in that route. In the top right-hand corner, you can see those peppers have just been sprayed. I think it was with chlorpyrifos. That chlorpyrifos has to break down, but if it's not, the withholding period is not long enough, that chlorpyrifos will get into the diet of the person who eats that pepper. And of course, the picture on the bottom right is a sad reflection of conditions many emergent farmers face. They don't have childcare. This mother is taking a child on her back into the field while she's mixing pesticides. So from an early age, there might be cumulative exposure. So what about the WHO pesticides in South Africa, the class 1A and 1B? Remember I said there were 91 listed by WHO. In 2017, the department listed its list of pesticides, Department of Agriculture, that had been banned or withdrawn. Of that list, there were only 10 that were on the WHO class 1A and B list. And of those, half were 1A, half were 1B. So of the other 81, it's hard to say how many are really registered in South Africa because, as you know, we don't have public access to a database, but you have to apply to CropLife to get that information. But Quinn and colleagues published a paper in 2011 where they listed all the pesticides that were then registered. And if you take that list and you compare it to the WHO list and you take account of those pesticides that were banned or reported as banned in 2017, it's probably about 20 to 25 class 1A and 1B, 1B and 1A pesticides are registered in South Africa. You'll see some of the banned pesticides listed. Aldicarb was banned in 2016. Turbifos is not banned, but was restricted supposedly in 2023. Its LD50 is actually lower, meaning it's more toxic than quite a number of other pesticides that are banned, that are 1A, 1B, and even a class 2 chlorpyrifos pesticide. So we don't really have any consistency in our regulatory framework at the moment. So how's the Department of Agriculture chose to deal with highly hazardous pesticides? In 2010, It brought out a pesticide management policy for South Africa 15 years ago. And what it said was pesticides should be considered for phase out, severe restrictions and bans, and it listed the following: endocrine disruptors, POPs, carcinogenic pesticides, immunotoxins, WHO class 1A and B, as well as pesticides associated with frequent and severe poisoning incidents. So that's well and good. That replicates the language of international HHP move. But what did the department do? It took the decision that endocrine disruptors, POPs, carcinogenic pesticides, and immunotoxins would be slated for phase out, meaning they would either ban them or allow the registration to lapse. But of course, there's also been this process where derogations are now permitted, so you can actually get out of this phase out by motivating to the department, and that's another story. But strangely, what they did for the WHO class 1A and 1B pesticides, as well as pesticides associated with frequent and severe poisoning, was to say we're going to manage that through a restricted category, meaning we're going to restrict who can buy it, who can apply it, how they can apply it, etc., etc. But the consequences of trying to manage HHPs as restricted are not very favorable. So as we know, the terrible tragedy in Naledi with the poisoning of the kids arose because that highly hazardous pesticide, Chlorpyrifos, was not properly managed. In Parliament, we know that at least 2 companies were inspected and found to be in violation of regulation, and we still don't have a proper system for implementing supposed restrictions on pesticides, and we don't have enforcement. So the Western Cape, for example, has 3 inspectors for the entire province to enforce Act 36. We also know that in 2024, the National Institute for Communicable Disease, who are responsible for notifiable medical conditions, including non-communicable conditions, they received 450 reports of child pesticide poisoning in 1 year. So we are not managing HHPs properly. But in addition to that, the WHO classification 1A and 1B doesn't adequately capture all the acute hazards. So here's some examples. Aluminum phosphide is a fumigant. It's used in the sort of grains, wheats. Basically, you put it in a silo and it fumigates the contents, kills everything living inside. The problem is if it comes into contact with water, it releases phosphine gas, which is highly toxic. And sadly, it's available. You can buy it, and it can cause be fatal and has been responsible for fatalities. And it's used for suicide in the main. It's not listed as a WHO class 1A, 1B because it's a fumigant. It's actually got a slightly different classification. Dormex, cyanamide. So that is registered in South Africa. It's banned in the EU. It causes dermal irritation, caustic burns. Many farm workers complain about it. It wouldn't qualify as a WHO class 1A, 1B. And I think you've heard about paraquat. It's actually a class 2 in terms of its acute toxicity because of when it's mixed, when it's diluted. It doesn't make the cutoff for 1A and 1B, but we know that it's a really, really, really nasty agent because there's no antidotes. And if you take the concentrate, you will go through sequential organ failure, ending up with irreversible lung fibrosis, and you basically die of asphyxia because your lungs can't get enough air. That it doesn't kill laboratory animals as quickly as other pesticides is simply a fairly arbitrary fact, but it wouldn't make the WHO class 1A and B cutoff, but it is clearly a really horrible. So the second category is those that present particularly high chronic hazard. And we have a globally harmonized system of classification and labeling of chemicals that provides the benchmark for deciding whether something is carcinogenic, whether it has endocrine disrupting effects, immune effects, chronic respiratory effects, whether it's neurotoxic, and whether it's a skin toxic. So the picture on the top on the right is of a farmer from the Northern Cape who developed a rare neurological condition called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a disease of transient neuropathy, which recovers, but you can see He's been left with some deformity due to the nerve damage in his legs. The bottom right, a farmer is actually doing a dexterity test. It's called the Santa Ana pegboard, which is a measure of the subtle neurotoxic effects of many pesticides. Here's a review, fairly old, of neurobehavioral effects of organophosphates, and you can see on many of the different psychological and cognitive and memory tests, the review shows in a meta-analysis that organophosphate pesticides have a wide range of these neurological impacts on human functioning. And for children, this was a fairly old study, but very graphic. Buzzy Gillette is an anthropologist who did this study with colleagues in Mexico. On the left-hand side are drawings produced by children who live in what were foothills. In other words, they were living in an elevated part of this valley, the Yaqui Valley. And their drawings, this is called Draw a Man. It's a standard neurodevelopmental test of childhood development. You can see the drawings on the left. The children are much more able to conceive and convey images and have the capacity to do it, compared to the children on the right, where the drawings are much more scanty and skeletal and undeveloped. And that's a reflection of the child's neurodevelopment at that age of about 50, 70 months, 5, 6 years old. And this man is Viktor Yushchenko, the former Ukrainian president, who was poisoned with dioxin. We won't go into why, but he was poisoned cumulatively. Dioxin is not a pesticide, but it's a contaminant of many pesticides. It's something produced when any plastic burns. When you have chlorine and carbon burning, it will produce dioxin. And if you dispose of pesticides through burning them, in fact, many things, you have to burn it at very, very high temperatures to make sure you don't produce dioxin. It's a carcinogen, known carcinogen, and it's a very nasty immunotoxin. So it's not a chemical you want, but it is a byproduct in production of many pesticides. So 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T, which were the elements of Agent Orange, sprayed in the Vietnam jungles, had a lot of dioxin in it because they sprayed a lot of the pesticide, and there's a lot of dioxin consequences in Vietnam that have been poorly documented, but it illustrates the problem of additives and contaminants. Glyphosate itself is not acutely toxic, but it's acutely toxic in the formulations it's applied in because of a surfactant, a kind of a soap, which makes it possible to get the glyphosate to stick to the plants. And it's the surfactant that's actually responsible for the deaths of many people who attempt suicide with glyphosate. And of course, we live in a chemical world, so you don't get exposure to one chemical at a time. You have synergistic effects. So it's all difficulties in assessing toxicity. I think the story of glyphosate is very interesting because it illustrates how difficult this space is. The International Agency for Research on Cancer undertakes expert assessment of chemicals for carcinogenicity. It's a WHO agency. In its classification, category 1 is a known carcinogen, sufficient evidence, carcinogenic in humans. It has two categories for category 2. One is where there's limited human evidence and sufficient animal evidence. So it's called probably carcinogenic. Whereas category 2B is that they're not really sure it's possibly carcinogenic. There's limited human evidence and less than sufficient animal evidence. And category 3 they can't classify. In 2015, IARC upgraded their classification for glyphosate from 2B to 2A based on the human evidence that was presented. And there was a massive outcry, very fierce resistance. People accused the IARC of politics. And of course, every other agency did their own assessment, and the US EPA came to a different assessment at the time. And we have to recognize glyphosate is a huge money spinner for industry, and much of what went on had to do not with the science, but with the economics. And the point of our point of this is to illustrate that the GHS, what it does, it brings harmonization of the categories, not the actual chemicals. So it doesn't say glyphosate is a carcinogen or probable carcinogen, which is what IARC says. It says if you wanted to define something for carcinogenic, then it has to meet the following criteria. And every country can then do its own risk assessment. And here you have three material safety data sheets for glyphosate, and they all say different things for glyphosate. And they're all fairly recent. And in fact, one of them says carcinogenicity not classified, which is actually quite frankly wrong. But you can see how difficult it is to translate a framework piece of directive into actual hard data, which is why we have such a hard time. Okay, I want to close with the last part of the other conditions of use in our country. So on the left is the picture I showed earlier, a man who lost his job on a farm. He was the spray operator on the farm. He now sells his labor on the cotton fields in northern KwaZulu-Natal. That is his job. He doesn't know anything better. That's the condition of use of that pesticide where he works. Industry will, of course, blame him for being stupid or ignorant, for not using protective clothing, etc., etc. But that's not the point. The point is that is the use situation facing him. Picture in the middle is another farmer from KZN. We were visiting for a research project at the time. We asked her if she could show us any of the pesticides she uses. She got her daughter very proudly to go fetch this 5-liter container, which is a red label pesticide, methylmorphos, class 1B, I think. And look at the top of the container. The lid has a melted candle on it. She'd been using it in her shed as a stand for her candle while she did work in the fields overnight. So this is the conditions of use in the country, and you have to take that account in considering what's an HHP. And of course, as Anna just said, this is the other problem of conditions of use in urban areas where pesticides are used for purposes they're not registered for. The children in Naledi died after eating snacks thought to have been purchased from a local spaza shop, although that's really unclear. And in total, 6 children died from tuberculosis poisoning. So just to conclude, we have lots of problems in establishing the causation of pesticide harms because for many chronic conditions such as cancer, there's a long latency. There are many other causes of that cancer. We also have synergistic effects of exposure to multiple chemicals that we don't have good statistical methods to address. You have the problem of other chemicals in the compound that's actually available. And there are few outcomes that are specific to the agent. If you work in environmental health, if you get mesothelioma, you are more or less 100% sure that you've been exposed to asbestos. We don't have that with pesticides because the outcomes can be produced by many kinds of toxins. But nonetheless, there's growing evidence that pesticides are associated with a wide array of acute and chronic health effects. And so that's why the phase out of highly hazardous pesticides is urgently needed to reduce risk to human health and the environment. Thanks. I'll take questions. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Prof. Really appreciate that. Really very compelling. And thank you for helping to demystify the health impacts. There was a question above by somebody with a code name. Is the distinction between human and environment health a framework issue? Can a single toxicity category remove wiggle room for industry to impede the pace of reform and reduction? Okay, so there are a few questions here. I'm not sure if you want to answer one at a time. The first one is the distinction between human and environmental health a framework issue?
Well, it's also an evidence issue. So, I mean, many of the pesticides that are harmful to the environment are also harmful to humans and vice versa, but it doesn't have to be like that. So, you know, ironically, DDT was thought to be really safe when it was introduced, but it's really bad for the environment, and now we know it's not so safe. Wiggle room, industry will always find wiggle room no matter what. I think you can't really have one classification that bridges both. It's not always the case. Extremely toxic compounds are damaging to the environment. So, for instance, something might break down very quickly in the environment.
Prof, I just wanted to go through, just for some of the people that might not be super technical, with regards to It might seem very obvious to most of us that work in the space, but just the differences between chronic and acute, because this is how the highly hazardous pesticides, some of the criteria are broken up. So acutely toxic would mean on one exposure, basically, you're at risk of severe or irreversible effects. Is that correct?
Well, kind of. It's usually the case, but not always. So basically, acute means you fall down. If you think about it, you collapse. You have an acute problem. Sometimes you can be exposed repeatedly to organophosphates, and you develop a bit of tolerance. Basically, your body adapts, and
Right.
then suddenly you get another exposure, and your body can no longer adapt, and you get really sick very quickly.
And
So
you fall
it's
down.
basically getting sick quickly, and usually it's from one big exposure, but not always.
Right. And then chronic, which is what a lot of us are exposed to, are small amounts over time that build up and then can cause a disease or irreversible harm that we then can't link to any specific cause. So this is where the advocacy becomes difficult because we can't really link it specifically to something that we've been exposed to, where there's so many different environmental toxins that we are exposed to. So that's something that's very helpful to industry, but not helpful to us. Although I saw Professor Leslie Petrick post recently that there's now a new model for proving toxicity using sperm count, but we need to unpack that. I also just wanted to unpack for everybody that are not researchers or scientists in the group, synergistic effects. So what's really important to note is that very often a crop will be sprayed with multiple pesticides, and it will also have multiple ingredients in that formulation. And when there is testing done for registration, the toxicology trials that need to be done, it's only one active ingredient that is tested in isolation, not the combined effects of how it might be used in real life or with what it is formulated in the end product that you're buying. So this is a terrible, terrible, glaring flaw with regulations, and that's worldwide. And that's something that our global campaigns need to address. And then, yeah, like one of your last points was, it said few of the impacts we're able to point out come from specific agents, and that's because of these accumulative or multiple exposures that we've got everywhere. Okay, so I just also wanted to mention that, and I'll get there when it's my turn, but we have classified, UnPoison has classified glyphosate as a criteria 8, as a HHP. But we'll obviously have a hard time getting industry or government possibly to come up to align with that classification. Any burning questions for Prof? Please feel free to shout out popcorn style. Okay.
I've just posted something that
Sure.
I was starting to reply to somebody just to say that we had an amazing talk by a farm manager at Goedgedacht, which is a farm in River Castile, where he basically described how he became converted from being totally dependent on pesticides to realizing that you actually need to know the soil, you need to know the climate, you need to know the crop to manage the crop. And basically most farmers just abdicate that sense of ownership, and he forced him not to use pesticides for a while. And it's the most compelling story, so I really urge you to hear him at some point.
Thanks, Prof. I'll chase you up for that, and we'll have him on another webinar in the future. And I think you also just touched on a point that is one of the things that creates so much of our loss of rights, is that we outsource so many things to other people. We give authority to other experts or whatever it is to manage so many important parts of our own daily life or our own professions. And I think one of the great invitations to take sovereignty back is to really just inform yourself of the things that are in your immediate life, your food, your environment, your work, and also your legislation and the things that govern you. Great. Okay, so any other questions can be popped into the chat. And I would love to hand over to Debbie Muir from DFFE, who will talk about the various classifications and also a great new announcement with regards to protecting our African women and women farm workers. Thanks, Debbie. Over to you.
Thank you, everybody. Can you see my presentation?
We can. It's not in presenter view, but that doesn't matter.
Hold on a sec. I'll get it there for you. Can you see it now, presentation mode?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. So let me start. Okay, so I'm going to give you a presentation on the new PPE for women. I'm very excited about this project. And then some classifications and explanations on what GHS is and ECHA and how the two work together.
Just hold on a second. Don't forget what nobody knows what PPE is, so we need to just make sure we explain the acronym.
It's in the next slide. Okay, so PPE is personal protective equipment. So South Africa joined the global International Convention on Personal Protective Equipment Initiative in 2023 after seeing the work that was done in Kenya. South Africa is part of the Global ICPP Initiative Working Group 1 and Working Group 3. Working Group 1 is regarding the ICPPE exposure tool, and Working Group 3 is regarding the PPE itself. So South Africa brought a new perspective to the Global ICPPE Initiative when we discussed bringing in the gender-specific PPE for women, because in South Africa we have social cultural norms in certain areas of South Africa where women cannot wear pants, and also we brought in the knowledge to the global ICPPE project to say that we need to comply to the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the UN 1979, Article 11(1)(f), protection of women with regards to health and safety, safeguarding of the function of reproduction, and Article 2D, providing special protection to women in types of work proved to be harmful to them. Now, South Africa is actually the only country in the world that is actually compliant to the United Nations Convention on the Protection of Women with regards to protecting women with PPE, which I'm very, very, very proud of. So the ICPP initiative, the strategy is that there is a steering committee which looks at the strategy and the scoping of the project. Working Group 1 looks at the development of the global database and the operator exposure model for handheld applications, so with knapsack sprayers and handheld sprayers relevant to many regions of the world. And then Working Group 2 looks at the comparison of the dermal absorption approaches with a focus on default values. So to look at how we can put in the dermal absorption values to work out how we can have a sort of a tool that we can import values into that we can then which will then give you the PPE values that you need to almost like dress your operator in. Working Group 3 looks at the PPE for risk mitigation based on exposure studies and partial body garments to balance protection and comfort. And Working Group 4 is based on the outcome of Working Groups 1 to 3, which is the development of a user-friendly risk assessment tool. But basically, so the dermal absorption approaches is so when you have an operator, the dermal absorption is basically through the skin. So it doesn't matter where through the skin. So it could be anywhere. It could be on your hands. It could be on your feet. It could be on your legs, your arms, even your face. So anywhere where there's contact with your skin would be the dermal absorption. So, but mostly it would be on your mostly the sort of like around the top of your head and your arms, your neck, your legs, for instance, when you're looking at dermal absorption here with regards to the working group to outcome. So what we're looking at when you're looking at PPE, we are looking at exactly this. So the global template for PPE is for a 60-kilogram man, 2 meters tall, a Swedish male. This is not appropriate for the African build. So the Kenyan project looked at PPE, personal protective equipment, for the African build, which was appropriate for African men. So they developed, when I talk about C1 garments, I'm talking about overalls. So they have developed an overall, a top, a separate overall with a top and a pants, C1 garment, which is for the African build. So it actually it suits African build properly, but unfortunately it does not cover women. So they've designed and developed and manufactured the C1 garment, the overalls, and it's a split overall, top and the bottom, and it's a all-in-one overall. So that's very, very exciting. So if you look at the pictures over here, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but you can see the separate overall where there's the top and the bottom, and that's the all-in-one overall. So how was this done? It was done from the bottom up. So it was actually farmers in the Nagura group of farmers and the Nyahururu group of farmers that with Syngenta and ICPPE that looked at what sort of PPE that would need. So there were 180 applicants or applicators or farmers, and they looked at 18 focus group meetings, and they looked at various crops. And after all of the 168 applicators and the different PPE versions, they came up with those two overall types. Oops, sorry, let's go back. Oh, sorry, let's go back one. So they came up with the split overall and the single overall. And it was then also launched as the first ISO 27065 pesticide garment in Kenya. So what that means, it has an international safety accreditation, that overall. And it's chemically resistant overall. So it's not just a normal overall. It's an overall for pesticide operators to use, which is resistant to pesticides, which is a really, really plus. So here is the two prototypes. So the one prototype that they developed has got the elasticated feet at the bottom here, as you can see, and the other prototype has got the zip. And the difference here would be whether they are working in a normal field, they would have the elasticated bottom to put on a safety boot, and that elasticated bottom would go in the safety boot. These ones over here with the zip at the side is manufactured for rice paddies, where the gum boot goes inside the overall and it's zipped up on the side. These are chemically resistant and waterproof overalls. Okay, and now we come to the female PPE, which we developed in South Africa. This was our first prototype, which we developed probably in 2023. So South Africa looked at 6. We got 6 of these double aprons to have a look at, and Kenya got 6. And basically this was our original first design, was a sort of a double apron with 3 different versions or 3 different PVC layerings to see which PVC would protect, would be more suitable protection. And our teams got the briefing that they had to wear they had to wear the double apron at least 30 times and provide us feedback. And with that feedback, we are now in our third prototype already. But what we are at the moment, which we are very excited about, is our prototype for our cultural PPE. So the skirts for the ladies that cannot wear pants due to cultural reasons. And our first skirt designs have been drawn up, and the first prototype is being developed and will be available on the 15th of May, which is very, very exciting for me. Okay, so now we shift to looking at the World Health Organization and the global harmonization system of classification and labeling. And now we ask the question, why the shift? Why are we moving from, why did we move from WHO to GHS? The shift was from WHO to GHS was driven by the need for international standardization and improved hazard communication. The WHO system faced challenges with global trade and varied language and literacy levels, making it difficult to ensure consistent and understandable hazard communication. There was also an issue with color-coded bands, which with regards to red-green colorblind, because the most hazardous was the most highly hazardous was red, and the unlikely to cause a hazard was green or blue. So some people with red-green colorblind, which was 0.2% of the global population, are red-green colorblind, would have confused the color codes. So that was another issue. So the Global Harmonized System of Classification and Labeling of Chemicals, the GHS, the system was developed by the United Nations to standardize the hazard communication for chemicals worldwide. The GHS aims to provide a consistent way to classify and label chemicals, ensuring that workers and consumers can understand the hazards associated with the chemicals they use. So this doesn't just provide for government organizations and chemical companies, but also for the workers and the consumers, so that you can understand the hazards that the chemical that the chemical poses. So the key aspects of GHS is the standard hazard classification, standard labeling, and the standard SDS. Those are the three key aspects. So under the standard hazard classification, the GHS defines and classifies chemicals based on their physical, health, and environmental hazards. So there's three. So under the GHS, under the standard hazard classifications, there's three: physical, health, and environment. Then when we get to standard labeling, GHS specifies the information that must be included on the chemical's label, including pictograms, signal words, and hazard statements. So on the labeling, there has to be three things on the label for GHS. There has to be a pictogram, which is the little skull and crossbones, or the environment sign. There must be a signal word, and there must be a hazard statement. Then a standard SDS. On the standard SDS, the format and content of the safety data sheets must provide detailed information about chemical hazards and safety precautions, and it must have all of the 16 hazards or 16 classifications on this SDS. If it does not have all of the 16 classifications on the SDS, it does not conform to a GHS safety data sheet. I can't see what the heading is of this one. Oh, so
what does it do?
The ECHA, Oh, what does it do? Thank you. I can't see because my slides. So what does it do? It addresses classification of chemicals by types of hazard. It proposes harmonized hazard communication elements, including the labels and safety data sheets. It ensures that information on physical hazards and toxicity of the chemicals are available. So it makes sure that if there are any physical hazards, it is on the label, as well as the toxicity of the chemicals. It enhances the protection of human health and the environment during the handling, transportation, and use of these chemicals. It also provides a basis for the harmonization of rules and regulations on chemicals at the national, regional, and global level, an important factor also for trade facilitation. Sorry, I'm tripping over my words today. My apologies. So who is it for? Who's it meant for? It's meant for governments, regional institutions, and international organizations. It contains sufficient context and guidance for those in the industry who will ultimately be implementing the requirements which have been adopted. The plan of implementation, paragraph 22C, that was adopted in Johannesburg on the 4th of September 2002 at the World Summit on Sustainable Development, encouraged the implementation of GHS as soon as possible. And the first edition of the GHS, otherwise known as the Purple Book, was adopted in December 2002. And we are currently on the 10th revised edition of the GHS. And we are looking forward to the 11th edition, which should be coming out hopefully by the end of 2025. So this is what you should be looking for, or what you should see. So what the Purple Book looks like, or the Globally Harmonized System of Classification and Labeling of Chemicals, the GHS, the Purple Book, the 10th revised edition looks like, what you see on your right-hand side. My cursor's not working. At the top left-hand corner, you will see the hazard pictograms, all 9 of them that you will find under GHS. The ones that are applicable to health would be the skull and crossbones, the exclamation mark, and the health hazard. The ones applicable to the environment would be the environment one, and the gas cylinder and the corrosion are generally the physical hazards, but can also be relevant to environment. So those two will double as environment and physical hazards. And then your label elements for your acute toxicity you can find in table 3.1.3 in the Purple Book, and this is what it gives you. This is what an example of what you should see. So you should see a symbol, which would be either a skull and so under category 1 would be a skull and crossbones, category 2 again a skull and crossbones, category 3 a skull and crossbones, category 4 is an exclamation mark, and category 5 no symbol. The signal word would be danger for categories 1 to 3 and warning for categories 4 to 5. And then your hazard statements for oral exposures, it's fatal if swallowed for categories 1 and 2, which means fatal if swallowed means you will die. You will die if you swallow it. Categories 3, it's toxic if swallowed, which means you won't die, but it's going to be very difficult to keep you alive. Category 4 is harmful if swallowed, which means you're going to get sick, but you won't die. And category 5 may be harmful if swallowed. So there's not enough information to prove that it is harmful if swallowed. The dermal is the same. Fatal if in contact with skin. So in other words, the dermal is in contact with skin. So dermal, so fatal if contact with skin, which means you can still die if it's fatal in contact with skin, because it will be absorbed through your skin and it will then end up in your organs, and that way you could die. Fatal if contact is the same. Toxic if contact with skin. You can absorb it through your skin. It will end up in your organs, and you could get very sick. Harmful if contact with skin, same thing. It will be absorbed through your skin, and you will get sick. Inhalation. The inhalation is through your nose and through your mouth, not just your nose. So breathe it in. So fatal if inhaled means if it's fatal if you inhale it, if you breathe it in. Toxic if inhaled is it's going to be toxic if you breathe it in, and harmful if inhaled means it'll be harmful if you breathe it in. So that's basically just a quick sort of explanation of the label elements for acute toxicity. Now here is the South African HHP list, going to give you an example or show you how, I just want to see if I've got a cursor here. No, okay. So you will see here through the FAO, WHO, JMPM criteria, as was discussed earlier, you have category 1, which is the WHO 1A, 1B. Categories 2, 3, and 4, that's where the GHS falls in. 5, 6, and 7, those are your MEAs, your multilateral agreements, and 8 is the high incidence of severe and irreversible effects on human and environment. And here's your GHS classifications, where you have your hazard classes and categories, your hazard pictograms, and your hazard statement. So I've just given you 3 examples here for benomyl, carbendazim, and co-formulant, which is, as we say, the other gunk in the formulation, the other stuff, not the active ingredient itself, but something else they put in the formulation, which is generally not mentioned. But in this case, with the new regulations, amended regulations that were promulgated in June, promulgated in 2024, it does say that if there is a hazardous substance in the formulation, it has to be notified on the label and the SDS. So here we go. Here's one of them. Naphtha, heavy aromatic solvent, is a carcinogenic and mutagenic. So it has to be put on the label. So to give you an example, benomyl, for instance, is a mutagenic and reproductive tox. So it falls into the GHS under category 3 and 4. Oh, sorry. And so you see here then it's acute tox, skin irritant, skin sense 1, acute tox 3, STOT C3. There it is, muta 1B. But you don't see the reproductive one here. And that the reason for that is that the reproductive tox 1 GHS 1 here is it actually it's listed under here under H360, may damage fertility or the unborn child, and it's H360 FD, may damage fertility, may damage the unborn child. So that's where it comes from to be listed under category 4. Carbendazim the same, where it's a reproductive, it's a muta 1B, repr 1B, and here you have the H340 may cause genetic defects. H360 may damage fertility or the unborn child. H360 FD may damage fertility, may damage the unborn child. And with naphtha, it's also, naphtha is a carcinogenic and a mutagenic. So it's a muta 1B and a carc 1B. And here it falls here under H340 may damage genetic defects, danger germ cell mutagenicity. And here H350 may cause cancer. So that's where you link the hazard class to the hazard statement. And then here is the hazard pictogram, which links to the hazard statement and the hazard class. The comments were just put in to just take the reader of the HHP list through some of the issues with regards to that pesticide, to just make it more understandable. Okay, so ECHA stands for the European Chemicals Agency. It's responsible for implementing and managing the European Union's chemical legislation, REACH regulation. It ensures the safe use of chemicals in Europe. It protects human health and the environment and promotes innovation and competitiveness in the chemical industry. ECHA is an independent regulatory agency with its own legal personality, but it works in collaboration with other EU institutions and agencies. So what are the key aspects? The implementing of the REACH regulations. REACH stands for Registration, Evaluation, Authorization, and Restriction of Chemicals. So its main chemicals law. It requires the manufacturers and importers to register and evaluate the risks of chemicals they place on the market. The management of the registration process manages the registration of chemicals and ensures that companies provide sufficient information and access the potential risks of those chemicals. And the provision of guidance and support offers guidance and support to chemicals on complying with chemicals legislation. The management of other chemical-related legislation. It manages other EU regulations, including the classification, labeling, and packaging, the CLP regulation, and promotion of safe use of chemicals. Works to ensure that chemicals are used safely throughout their life cycle, from production to disposal, or as we say, the cradle to grave principle, and provision of information on chemicals. The central source of information on chemicals in Europe, including their hazardous properties, classification, and safe use guidelines. This is the CNL inventory, which is basically the database of all chemicals in Europe. So the HHP, again, here's exactly the same spreadsheet I showed you earlier, but I've just here included ECHA. So now you can now look at what GHS has said and what ECHA has said, and you can see that ECHA and the GHS pretty much are exactly the same. So they use the same data. And they come to the same conclusions, but not always. Sometimes ECHA is more precautionary than GHS. Sometimes GHS is more precautionary than ECHA. So what most government departments do is they actually use both ECHA and GHS to make sure that they have the most precautionary information available to protect the consumer in the country. So in conclusion, PPE for women is needed globally, and South Africa will be the first country globally to conform to the United Nations Convention on the Protection of Women. African countries will now have PPE, personal protective equipment, fit for purpose for both genders, not just men. So excited. And GHS is a system developed by the United Nations to serve all countries, and ECHA is an independent regulatory agency, but it works in collaboration with other EU institutions and agencies, but they serve the same purpose, which is they are vital tools for ensuring the safe and responsible handling of chemicals, protecting human health and the environment, and facilitating trade. And with that, I thank you.
Thank you so much, Debbie. Sure, really excellent work on the PPE, something to be proud of for South Africa. And also just something I'd love to share with our audience is the Department of Fisheries, Forestry and Environment has also managed to significantly cut their pesticide use and highly hazardous pesticide use as a department in the last 5 years. So while previously it was one of the highest pesticide users in the country, Debbie and her department have managed to radically reduce the application of pesticides and highly hazardous pesticides. So yeah, it's when we think about government, we must also think about the great civil servants that are really making a difference. Okay, so just I'm getting onto, I see about the list. So I'm getting onto the list that is published in South Africa and where you can access it. And I will also be demystifying further the analysis.
Wait, Anna, can I just
Yes,
ask Debbie something? So
please.
one of the questions in the chat was about what to do if the MSDS is not compliant with GHS. Does Department of Environment do the monitoring and enforcement, or who will enforce that label when SDS is not compliant?
That would be the Department of Employment and Labor.
The Labor and Agriculture are responsible, essentially.
Yeah, the GHS compliance is entirely Department of Employment and Labor.
And the pesticide label?
The pesticide label is the Department of Agriculture, but the GHS compliance is Department of Employment and Labor.
Okay.
So there's a new round of comments on Act 36, which is the piece of regulation around registering pesticides. And in our comments, in UnPoison's comments, we asked for his department, so under Department of Agriculture, we asked that his department actually approves the labels to make sure that they are compliant with GHS. So I'm not sure if that will be introduced into when the regulations are promulgated, because like I say, it's in draft form at the moment, and there's a comment round that's busy in place. But that is something that we asked for in our comments, and our advocacy is that the regulator and his office approves compliance of those labels. So let's see. Any other questions, popcorn style, before I move on? Okay, excellent. So a lot of what Debbie spoke about, hold on a second, I see two. So there's public. Okay, so I'm going to, is there public access to the government department based on data of pesticide use? So I'm going to cover quite a bit of that in my presentation, but one of the greatest challenges that we have as civil society is lack of transparency and lack of access to data. And I'll get into that a bit more. Susan Haffman's from Pan Germany has said, I just wanted to remind that the International Code of Conduct on Pesticide Management advises pesticides whose handling and application require the use of personal protective equipment that is uncomfortable, expensive, or not readily available should be avoided, especially in the case of small-scale users and farm workers in hot climates. So thank you for that, Susan. I actually had some questions, Debbie. I just have to go back to, when you were showing about the different categories and up to category, all of the pictograms, and then the categories up to 1 to 3, it was like fatal if swallowed, and then 4 was severely harmful, severe risk. Are the category 1 to 3, so basically on one exposure, there's severe risk of irreversible harm or fatality for some of those pesticides. Are the public able to buy any of those pesticides in those categories? Are they registered for any kind of use that we might be able to access without the correct precautions?
Yes, red blocks.
Right. So, okay, so that's rodenticides, rat poison. So that's the kind of rat poison that we would buy at a retailer.
Yes, and all those Chinese pesticide type stuff that you buy, those are all category 1s.
Okay. When you say about the Chinese pesticides you buy, I wouldn't know about those. Where would who buy them?
If you go to any Chinese market, you get pesticides to kill rats, you get pesticides to kill flies, you get pesticides to kill ants, and a lot of those are highly hazardous pesticides, category 1s. I have a presentation pretty much just on sort of HHPs you buy in Chinese markets, basically. Okay. Yeah, there's a lot of those, and I think Prof will know pretty much exactly what they are. But yeah, it's there. Yes, the short answer is yes.
Okay, all right. So that's something for everybody to be very concerned about. Okay, so I'm going to jump in now because we're a little bit over time. If I would really appreciate our other experts to stay the course in case I need help answering questions. As I shared earlier in the presentation, I'm the network coordinator of UnPoison, which is a civil society network, and I will introduce it right now by sharing my presentation. And I will do my best to make a lot of these complicated, the complicated terminology and everything else accessible for everybody and demystify the nature of our work to help activate as many of the people that are in this audience and those that watch this webinar, to activate them to help change the status quo in South Africa. Right, let me share my screen. Okay, great. Here we are. I have already introduced myself. I'm UnPoison's Network Coordinator. And this particular talk is on our HHP database and our campaign to reduce and eliminate highly hazardous pesticides in South Africa. Just a little bit about UnPoison. We're a civil society network and a core NPO. And ultimately, our aim is to ensure a healthy, clean, just, and safe South Africa for all of us forever. So the main aspects of our advocacy and campaigning, if I can really simplify it, is to reduce and eliminate hazardous and toxic pesticides and agrochemicals in our food system, our environment, our urban areas, etc., and to promote and support the transition to safe alternatives and farming methods. So it's two sides of the same coin. So how do we do it? We're actually a network of networks. We've got quite a lot of different groups, but the real impact of UnPoison comes from an amazing high-level expert, strategic expert network, where we are very lucky to have the kinds of experts that you've heard on this presentation so far. We've got many other professors and scientists and top professionals, people working in policy, etc. And that helps to create a brain trust for many organizations to get access to the most up-to-date data, to be able to analyze what's going on. We're then able to respond to the changing regulatory landscape. We're able to comment or speak in the media, etc. And this incredible network provides the resources for amazing advocacy. We have become a voice in many conversations with government, where previously it has largely just been the chemical industry that has been in these discussions with government. And now we're starting to see a shift in the conversation and who's at the table. So how does this amazing network, how do we translate this into actual work? We have found that the most strategic way for us to be effective is by targeting the regulatory framework. If we can target our resources and our energy on analyzing and responding to and helping to change the actual regulations and policy, this has the greatest potential impact for South Africa. And then we also use the work that we do to generate PR. And that's how we get as much information as we can out into the public, and by having webinars like this. So the South African context is that we've got incredibly outdated regulations. So one of the main pieces of regulations that govern our pesticides and agrochemicals is from 1947, which is the time when Prime Minister Jan Smuts was around World War II. The regulations are also fragmented across departments. I believe there are about 14 pieces of regulations fragmented over most of the government departments like Trade and Industry, Department of Environment, Department of Agriculture, Department of Labor, Department of Health. And unfortunately, a lot of these government departments operate in silos. And so aligning all of these pieces of regulations so that they are, so that they're all aligned and there's not confusion about which department regulates what, because currently there's a lot of confusion about who does what, as you heard in Professor London's question. We've also got the problem of double standards in the global north. So pesticides that are illegal in Europe, in Britain, in America, and are being produced by the global north or sold by those countries are being exported in high volumes to the global south, South Africa, South America, to the east, etc., where we have weaker regulations and weaker, let's say, enforcement. We've also got double standards with regards to export versus local. I'll unpack that, but our residue levels, the produce that we produce for export and the produce that we eat locally, we've got different standards of monitoring the residue levels that are left on our fruit and vegetables or fresh produce. We've then got industry influence, whether that is by design or any other mechanism. It's largely been industry who have been the loudest or the most active stakeholders when it comes to policy and registration and legislation in South Africa, and also determining the kind of the system for agriculture in South Africa. So we need to tip that balance as civil society and as affected stakeholder groups. We need to start having a seat at the table. Then there's lack of transparency with what's going on. So the reason that we're having this webinar and that so many of these issues are not known to the public is it's very useful not to have all of this information known. So Sizwe, you brought it up. How do people make choices? And there's no information that is out there, and that's something that we have to change. We've got weak reporting systems, so many of the people in this group will know about when there's been a pesticide sprayed as part of the city's spraying, or an affected farming community or farm workers. How do you report it? How do you actually get information about it? How do you get any form of recourse from government? And that's really, it's a glaring gap for work that needs to be done in South Africa to strengthen and create efficient reporting and data capturing systems that actually make a difference to the person who is reporting. Currently, it's largely collection for data. As we've mentioned already, there's a lack of alternatives, and I'll go into that further. And there are large numbers of vulnerable groups, whether it's lower income areas exposed to rat poison or pollution or contamination, or farm workers, farming town areas, whether it's children and women exposed to endocrine disruptors, etc. We have very large, disproportionately large segments of our population, as Sizwe pointed out, exposed. And then there's also a difference between our import and export, which I've shared. Right, Andrea Rother also mentioned where we find highly hazardous pesticides. So it's not just in agriculture. We've already spoken about that. And Debbie has now mentioned rodenticides that we can buy in the retailer. So there's a lot going on with our weed control, with our pest control, with our grounds, in forestry, hospitality, mosquito control. DDT is still legally registered for mosquito control. And then just in numbers, so these numbers do change as more pesticides get registered, and as new information might come to light, we might realize that there's more highly hazardous pesticides with new data coming out or research coming out about the pesticide. So in South Africa at the time of this presentation, We've got 2,688 registered agrochemical products. Now that's active ingredients. So that's just the active ingredient. There are thousands more brand names and products that are actually registered for use in South Africa. I think something like 9,000 pesticide products are available legally to be used. Then what I'm going to be unpacking is that we have published South Africa's first list of highly hazardous pesticides, and 195 of these 2,688 are highly hazardous pesticides. 116 of those are banned in the EU, but still legal in South Africa, which is where I was talking about the double standards. And remember that when we look at 195 and 116, that's not saying that, oh, less than 10% of the pesticides we're using, the volume of pesticides we're using are highly hazardous. We could be using a large volume of highly hazardous pesticides compared to other pesticide use. So the fact that those numbers seem small in comparison is disproportionate to the actual use. And then we have multiple constitutional rights breached, which is why we all need to be part of the advocacy. But one of the most fundamental ones is the right to a safe and healthy environment that doesn't poison us. So a little bit more on the double standards. This comes from Public Eye, and the date this was published in about 2018, I think. And it said about highly hazardous pesticides represented then about 40% of the global market. And we estimate the share of highly hazardous pesticides worldwide to be around 60% in terms of the million tons. So the first one was in terms of the money, and the second one was in terms of the volume of pesticides used. And this would have gone up significantly between 2018 and where we are now. So as many highly hazardous pesticides have been banned in the EU and also the US, the easiest way to grow a business, so now we're talking about the corporate expansion of the companies that make these pesticides, is to expand into new markets, into new geographical areas like the Global South, South Africa, Southern Africa, Asia, and South America, where there are weak where there is weak legislation. And here we are, the case study for that. Then there is this slide, which I didn't animate and I can't see what's behind it. And it just says that the massive use of highly hazardous pesticides in lower middle income countries is a tragic case of exploitation and the false narrative of development that is far from sustainable. So this is a picture from 2018 Mail and Guardian, and something that I wanted to draw your attention to is, I think Andrea spoke about it earlier, is that we import all of our ingredients to manufacture the pesticides, but we also export. So we export to other countries around us. So this data here is from 2008 to 2018, and it says the volume of pesticide imports and exports, our trade in pesticides has doubled in that period, and I should imagine something similar has happened in the meantime as well. Here is more up-to-date information, and this was published by Amabongani in a very explosive article that they published on highly hazardous pesticides, and I'll share that as a resource. But you can see that our exports are just less than half of what our imports are. So South Africa plays a very important part, not only for what happens in our own geographical borders, but we really can influence what happens in the countries around us that we export to. So targeting our regulatory framework can have a knock-on effect for many other countries in Africa that we export to. Okay, so what I started saying when I spoke about the context is MRL stands for maximum residue level, and that's what the residues that are left behind on pesticides after they've been harvested and when they get to us as a consumer. Now, very often the residue levels on pesticides will decrease after they've been applied and decrease significantly. But our maximum residue levels, that's what's left on our produce. And South Africa has different standards with what we export. And to my knowledge, and I'd like our experts to fill in the chat section, there is currently no testing of our local produce before it gets to market or at market level. This is largely done voluntarily by some of the retailers, and it's not done necessarily by all the produce that they get. It's done in kind of spot. Some of the retailers will spot test, but largely what goes to the Epping market or the Johannesburg market has not undergone testing for residue levels. So what we're getting could be a very different story to the exposure that the countries that we're exporting to get. So now I'll just focus in on our advocacy around highly hazardous pesticides. You can find all of our published comments on our website, which is unpoison.org. And you can download all of these from the home page. And I really encourage you to, they're technical documents, but to be able to exercise your role and your ability for advocacy, I really invite you to take on these technical subjects and to slowly plow through them so that we can really start influencing the world and the country that we live in. Specifically, I'm going to be focusing on the database that we published in 2023, and then the update that we published in 2025. So why was publishing a database very important? So it was critical because the National Registry of Agrochemicals and Pesticides is held privately. And that means that as people that are affected, as the public, we can't go and look up, oh, how is it being, what are the pesticides that are being used? What's being used to spray our suburbs? What's being used to spray our crops? And it's really something that should be housed by the regulator himself. And it's something that we've been advocating for. We've been asking in our comments to the regulator, please, will you house the pesticide registrations? It seems like a conflict of interest that the pesticide industry themselves house the registration, the pesticide registrations and registration information. And in the latest updates to the 2023 update to the current regulation, it says that the regulator, he will update the database and it will be housed by the regulator. We're just trying to make sure that it gets published publicly. So until now, there's been no access to know what are highly hazardous pesticides or not in South Africa. And that's why our list is so important, is because now when you hear about a pesticide or your neighbor is using something, this is also very tricky because people using toxic pesticides will often try and do it secretively. And it's very, very difficult to find out from most farmers. I'm generalizing here, so please excuse the exceptions. It's very difficult often to find out what is being used. But that is the very first question when you see somebody spraying, when you see that there are weather conditions where there's drift, where there's not signage up to say we're spraying, don't enter this area, etc. Your very first port of call is to ask what is being sprayed and to ask to see the label. So here we have our first iteration, which was published. as a result of starting to advocate and not having the information. How do we advocate about phasing out pesticides if we don't even know what they are? So with the incredible brains trust in UnPoison, this database took eons to produce, but you can find here all of the highly hazardous pesticides that we know of. There might be more registered, but because that information is held privately, this is the lists that we publish are accurate within 1 or 2 pesticides that we haven't maybe been able to track down. So as you can see, we've broken it down. It's downloadable from our homepage. And if any researchers or scientists want the actual spreadsheet, I can give you a copy of that as well. So what we found was that there were 222 total highly hazardous pesticides. There were 30 that were fully banned, and 16 that were partially banned, and we included that in the total number. There were, in the EU, there were 57 at the time banned in the EU, and of that amount, only 8 were banned in South Africa and the EU. Then the Department of Agriculture issued a notice of pesticides that they would phase out by 2024. This has now moved to 2020. It's moved to 2025, and there were 28. There were actually 28 pesticides on that list. And throughout the presentation, we've had our experts talking about WHO 1A and 1B. And that is the group of pesticides that are the most acutely toxic, that are known, that have known harm, known carcinogens, or the exposure is known to cause harm to humans. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the terminology, because this is something that I have found very, very confusing. There are different classification systems and different classification systems used around the world. And this is also what makes it difficult and confusing and difficult to align the different regions, because different regions use different classification systems. So Debbie spoke about GHS and ECHA and WHO, because those are the classifications that we are now incorporating into our list or our database, because that's what the South African government is using. That is now what DELRAD is using. So those are the classifications. The criteria, as you've heard many times, are the JPM1 to JMPM1 to 8 of WHO and FHO, which are all of the criteria. Then there are hazard categories. So like we spoke about WHO 1A and 1B, and then we speak about CMR, which stands for carcinogenic, mutagenic, and reproductive tox, 1A and 1B. Professor London did unpack that, and his definitions are slightly different to mine, but largely the same. Category 1 is known or presumed. Category 2 is suspected, and then further broken down, Category 1A is based on human evidence, and Category 1B is based on animal evidence. Then in categories, we've got 2 very important terminologies or definitions: substances of concern and restricted agricultural remedies, and also referred to as restricted use products. So often you'll see RUPs. And I will go into those, I'll explain what those are, but they're very important because those have been added to the regulations, and highly hazardous pesticides are in South Africa now fall into one of those 2 categories. And according to those two categories, that determines what the use is or the phase out is, and it will determine the roadmap for those highly hazardous pesticides, and that roadmap is evolving. Then we've got the status of the pesticides. It can be registered, it can be banned, In South Africa, we've also got partially banned, and you'll see on our 2025 update, we haven't included partially banned, but we did on the 2023. So sorry for the confusion, because the EU and other regions don't recognize something as either partially banned or not. It's either in use or it's not in use. Then we have not authorized, so that's similar to what we had as banned. There's pending, so those that would be products that are busy being registered. Then we have illegal pesticides, and those are pesticides that are coming in from the east that are not being registered. So in the latest tuberphos crisis, there was a lot of blame on illegal pesticides, and that terminology means pesticides that have not been registered. Although in the case of tuberphos, we found that it was from registered pesticides, legally registered pesticides. Lastly, there's a status called withdrawn, and that's when the industry doesn't renew their registration. Then other important aspects of the terminology are active ingredients, like Professor London shared, and like when I discussed with him. It's only the active ingredients that are tested, that these are kind of looked at in isolation and not really looked at in real life context of the ingredients of pesticides and in how they are used, that can accumulate and act synergistically with other pesticides. And co-formulants are the other ingredients that go into the pesticides that help them to deliver their activity. Like Professor London said, very often it's something that ensures that the active ingredient will stick to the plant or stick to the application. So yeah, I found all of the terminology quite confusing, and I hope that this helps. Recently, in 2022, before the 2023 update, the regulator of agrochemicals, the Registrar of Act 36, he issued a notice saying that he was going to be phasing out carcinogenic, mutagenic, and reproductive toxic pesticides that fall into GHS 1A and 1B. So on our list, and I'll show you, let's just see if I've got that here. On our list, you can see, and on all of the other lists, it's criteria 2, criteria 3, criteria 4 that he issued a notice for phase out for. So you can go back and you can look at our highly hazardous pesticide database and you can see what those pesticides are, or you can monitor any exposure. Like for instance, the Poison Free Peninsula group, has managed to track down these labels, and some of those labels, the pesticides, are actually meant for phase out. So that's a whole piece of advocacy. So we were very happy that there was some movement to start phasing out highly hazardous pesticides, but it didn't say anything about the most acutely toxic class, which was criteria 1, WHO 1A and 1B. And so we've been engaged in advocacy around those pesticides also being banned and phased out. Currently, they're restricted use, and I'll explain that more. But recently, we saw with the tuberphos poisoning that it's unreasonable. The pesticides in that category are not being managed well enough for them to stay on the market. And there should be very rapid action from DELROD to mitigate that risk and to regulate the most acutely toxic class, as well as these that are chronically toxic. Okay, so in the 2023 update to the regulations, and I'm happy to share this as a resource after the presentation, we have these definitions and these categories of pesticides. The substances of concern, so these fall into criteria 2, 3, 4, and 5 actually on our list, and I'll show those to you. And then we have restricted use product or restricted agricultural remedies, which I spoke about in the last slide. Okay, so what I've got on the spreadsheet now is I've put it into the categories of restricted use and substances of concern, because this is now how the registrar has broken them down. And restricted use products require that a pest control operator, only a pest control operator can use restricted use products or apply them, or somebody needs to be directly supervised by a pest control operator. So if you've got a worker on a farm, the pest control operator actually needs to be present and actively supervising the person applying the pesticides. So those are the orange ones. And then substances of concern are what are meant to be phased out. But I'm going to go back to my Prezo. And share again. So when the registrar put out the notice of 2022, he gave us this list of 28 pesticides, but we have found on our list that there are significantly more that fall into this category. So while this is a great step to phase out 28, we actually found that there are 60 or more active ingredients that fall into this category according to our analysis. And one of the main reasons of doing our list is so that civil society researchers, activists, etc., can help to harmonize, make sure that what the information that the regulator has and is using is aligned, because we're applying the correct methodology. We're applying the best practice methodology to classify these pesticides. So there's no reason why there should only be a list of 28 that the regulator has, yet on our highly hazardous pesticide database, there's significantly more that fall into this category. On engagement with the regulator, however, I believe his list was determined by what industry had marked in their registration as falling into those categories. So our role is to align our data with industry, with the government, and make sure that those classifications and criteria and the databases that are used is the one with the most integrity. So Amabongani did this amazing article, and those 28 chemicals that are due to be phased out actually amount to 346 brands or products that are sold on the market. And you can see how they're broken down by industry. So the registrar, since saying that these chemicals need to be phased out, the regulator has introduced a process that allows industry to be exempt from, or allows industry to apply for exemption from some of this, from some of the phase out, or they're allowed a longer period to have their products on the market. And that's something that we've also really been engaging on and fighting, are these applications for exemption of not phasing out these pesticides. So in 2025, we updated our list. And as you can see, the partially banned is no longer on the list. And like Debbie showed, we have included the GHS classification and the ECHA classification because that's what our government is using. And I don't believe that there is a database. I don't even believe that the industry has a database like this, which would be so useful to policymakers, to those working in research and advocacy, to actually see the WHO classification and the GHS classification and the ECHA classification all on one database. So that's designed to make it easier for our policymakers and regulators to navigate their way around highly hazardous pesticide classification. So what we found from the 2025 database when we did the analysis is that we have a total of 224 highly hazardous pesticides legally in use, including those that are restricted, so only for pest control operators. We have 195 active ingredients. Remember, those are just active ingredients. It doesn't mean that will translate to many hundreds and potentially thousands of products, and also a potentially high volume that's being used as well. Out of our 195, there are 135 that are not approved in the EU. And still legal in South Africa are 116 of those pesticides. And that's where the campaigns against double standards are so important. A pesticide that is toxic in Europe is also toxic in South Africa in exactly the same mechanism. Another thing that we're wanting more transparency about are co-formulants. There isn't currently a list of co-formulants that is readily available. And that is more research and more advocacy that is needed. What are the ingredients that are being used in these formulations? Okay, so I've already unpacked quite a bit of that, and I'm not going to take too much of your time further. Chlorpyrifos and Cartap have been added to the ban list, and then Turbofos, which is that criteria 1 group, WHO 1A and 1B, acutely toxic, falls into all three of those restricted use criteria. So it really shouldn't be on the market. This was the derogation notice that I spoke about. So this is the notice that was published last year, so 2 years after the phase-out notice that said, okay, we're going to be taking a whole group of these pesticides off the market. 2 years later, a month or two before the phase-out was meant to have finished, the regulator published a notice to say, okay, well, here you can apply for exemption. And so industry has been applying for a number of derogations for a number of products that should actually be phased out. And none of the data that we're seeing from industry actually warrants going through this process at all. There's no exceptional circumstance currently for those pesticides to still being used. So just something that I wanted to show you, and this comes from Amabungani as well, is that there are 61 pesticide products that are applying for derogation. But apparently, and this is something that we learned about in the Amabungani article, is that there are private talks between industry and the department to reclassify 54 of those products, which means, so if something gets classified, let's say, out from being a substance of concern into restricted use, or it gets reclassified in another way, then those products will have found a loophole to prevent themselves from being phased out. So here's an example of how classification can be different. We've got one product that in the EU and other areas has these hazard criteria, has these hazard pictograms. And in South Africa, you can see that the may damage fertility is not included in the South African label. So how can we have the same pesticide sold in two different regions that has been registered with different categories and criteria? So that's something that that a lot of our work is trying to prevent, especially by publishing this highly hazardous pesticide database with all the correct pictures. So I just wanted to share what the main regulations are with regards to highly hazardous pesticides, and this is for use of any of you that are involved in advocacy. It's Act 36 of 1947, which is the Farm Feeds, Fertilizer and Agricultural Remedy Act, and that's under DELROD. It's the Hazardous Substances Act under Department of Health, and hazardous chemical agents under Department of Employment and Labor. And under that regulation is the GHS, which is this purple book, which you can actually download, and I've got the resource as a link, because the label is the law. So when we're talking about the regulations, etc., when it comes to you and I applying our rights or knowing our rights, or having any form of recourse, if the label is not used according to the law, then that is where it could be a criminal offense by whoever's using it. But that is how you can assert your rights, is by finding the label and seeing whether everything on the label was actually applied in how it was used. And just for everybody that might be using pesticides, please know that you really have to follow the application as specified on the label, because anything outside of that, you have no recourse, no protection, and it is actually criminal to do. So then there are useful links, and which I will share with you afterwards. And thank you. That's all from me. I hope that that helped to demystify things. Okay. All right. So yeah, I just on Shan's question, for the first time, this derogation notice was a public participation notice, and while the reclassification is a private conversation, which we're not happy about, at least there is a step forward to be part of a public process with the derogations. Although we would also like to have public participation around all registrations. Every time a pesticide is up for renewal or for registration, one of the things that we're advocating for is that needs to be a public participation process, not just the exemption of being phased out. But we have to celebrate our small wins, and a public participation for derogations is a small win. Any other questions? Okay, everybody, it is 5:10. I thank you so much for staying all the way to the end of the call. And please reach out to us. There's lots of resources on the UnPoison website. Please also have a look at the People's Tribunal of Agrotoxins. They've also got a lot of resources. And Professor Andrea Rother, her pesticide forum publishes, sign up to her pesticide forum. There's weekly articles. And please get in touch if you would like any of the resources. I will send out resources to everybody that responded yes on the calendar invite. So thank you, everybody. Go out there, make a difference, get clued up, demystify all of these very, very technical terminology so that you can exercise your constitutional rights and help to remedy a very toxic environment for all of us. So thank you so much. It was wonderful having you here. All the best, and see you next time.